The whispers followed Faith Sullivan like unwanted shadows across the dusty streets of Promise Creek. At 24, her empty cradle had become the town's favorite subject, each barren month adding to the weight of judgment she carried. It was April 1876, and in a frontier town where a woman's worth was measured by the children at her skirts, Faith had come up wanting. "Mornin', Mrs. Sullivan," Mrs. Abernathy called from her porch as Faith walked past, a basket of laundered linens balanced against her hip. The older woman's eyes drifted pointedly to Faith's flat abdomen. "Any blessed news to share?" Faith tightened her grip on the basket. "Just bringing clean sheets to the hotel, madam. Such a shame, working when you should be tending to home matters." Mrs. Abernathy's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Your poor husband." Faith continued walking, keeping her chin high despite the familiar sting. 3 years of marriage to Thomas Sullivan had yielded many things: a small home on the edge of town, long nights of tears, and increasingly bitter arguments, but no children. Thomas had made no secret of his disappointment, and lately his visits to the saloon lasted longer than his conversations with her. The Western Star Hotel stood at the center of Promise Creek, a 2-story wooden structure where Faith worked 3 days a week as a laundress. The extra money was necessary since Thomas's carpentry work had become sporadic, but she'd also grown to cherish the hours away from her husband's accusing stares. "Morning, Faith," called Dorothy, the hotel's housekeeper, as Faith entered through the back door. "Those for rooms 7 and 12? "Yes, and I've brought extra for the new guest." Faith set her basket on the workbench. "Is he still here? The cowboy everyone's talking about?" Dorothy nodded, lowering her voice. "Vaughn Hayes. Arrived yesterday from Montana Territory. Quiet type, but pleasant enough. Paid for 2 weeks up front. Says he's looking for ranch work." Faith sorted the linens methodically. "Any luck?" "Heading out to the Whitman place today, I heard." Dorothy paused in her sweeping. "Speaking of luck, Thomas stopped by looking for you last night." Faith's hands stilled. "What did he want?" "Didn't say, but he'd been drinking." Dorothy gave Faith's arm a gentle squeeze. "You know you can stay here if—" "I'm fine," Faith interrupted, forcing a smile. "He's just frustrated about work." Faith knew Dorothy didn't believe her, but appreciated that she didn't press further. She continued her tasks, moving efficiently through the hotel, changing linens and gathering soiled ones. As she approached room 7, the door opened suddenly, and she collided with a broad chest. "Pardon me, madam." The voice was deep, tinged with a slight drawl. Faith steadied herself, looking up into the face of a man she'd never seen before. He was tall, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. A cowboy hat hung from his hand, and his dark hair was in need of a trim. "My fault entirely," Faith said, stepping back. "I should have knocked." The man smiled, and something in Faith's chest fluttered unexpectedly. "No harm done. You must be the laundress Dorothy mentioned." He extended his hand. "Vaughn Hayes." "Faith Sullivan." She shifted her basket to shake his hand, noticing the roughness of his palm against hers. "Welcome to Promise Creek, Mr. Hayes." "Just Vaughn, please." His eyes lingered on hers for a moment longer than customary. "Promise Creek seems like a fine town." Faith nodded, though privately she thought of the judgmental stares and whispered comments that followed her daily. "It has its moments. I'd appreciate your recommendations on where to find a decent meal that isn't hotel fare." His smile was easy, without the undercurrent of pity or judgment she'd grown accustomed to. "Mabel's Cafe serves the best apple pie west of the Mississippi," Faith offered, "and her beef stew isn't to be missed." "Much obliged." Vaughn stepped aside to let her enter the room. "I'll seek it out this evening." Faith busied herself with changing the bedding, aware that he lingered in the doorway. "I hear you're looking for ranch work," she said to fill the silence. "That's right. Meeting with a Mr. Whitman today. Know anything about him?" Faith paused. He's fair, more so than some. Pays on time. She didn't mention that Oliver Whitman was also one of the few men in town who hadn't looked at her with disappointment when her marriage remained childless. His ranch is prosperous. Good to know. Vaughn watched her efficient movements. You've been in Promise Creek long? All my life, Faith replied, though sometimes I wonder what lies beyond these mountains. The confession surprised her. She rarely shared such thoughts with anyone, let alone a stranger. The world's a big place, Vaughn said thoughtfully, beautiful in ways that can catch a person off guard. Their eyes met briefly, and Faith felt a peculiar warmth spread through her chest. She quickly returned to her task. Well, I shouldn't keep you from your appointment. Vaughn nodded, settling his hat on his head. Thank you for the recommendation, Mrs. Sullivan. Faith, she corrected, then immediately wondered why she'd done so. Faith, he repeated, the name sounding different in his voice. Good day to you. After he left, Faith found herself standing motionless beside the freshly made bed, her heart beating in an unfamiliar rhythm. She shook herself mentally. This strange cowboy would find work at Whitman's, or perhaps move on to another town. Their paths would rarely cross, and she was married unhappily, perhaps, but married nonetheless. Faith finished her duties and walked home as the afternoon sun began its descent. Their small house stood apart from others, Thomas having built it before their wedding when hopes ran high and promises flowed easily. She saw no sign of her husband, but noticed the whiskey bottle on the table was emptier than when she'd left that morning. She prepared a simple meal, knowing Thomas would likely come home hungry if he came at all. As she peeled potatoes, her mind drifted to the cowboy with the kind eyes. There had been no judgment there, no measuring of her worth against an absence, just a simple human connection that had felt like drawing a full breath after years of shallow ones. The door banged open, startling her. Thomas stood in the doorway, swaying slightly. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his words slightly slurred. "The hotel, Thomas. It's Tuesday." He grunted, dropping heavily into a chair. "Saw Jenkins today. His wife's expecting their fourth." Faith's knife paused mid-slice. "That's wonderful for them." "Wonderful," Thomas repeated bitterly. "Every man in this town has children to carry on his name. Every man but me." Faith resumed her work, keeping her voice level. "We've been over this. 3 years, Faith. 3 years I've waited while you avoid your duty as my wife." The knife clattered onto the table as Faith turned to face him. "My duty? As though I've refused you? As though I don't cry myself to sleep each month when my courses come?" Thomas's face darkened. "Maybe if you weren't so busy with your laundry and gossip." "I work because we need the money," Faith interrupted. "Because your carpentry jobs have dwindled while your drinking has increased." The blow came without warning, the back of his hand connecting with her cheek. Faith staggered, catching herself against the counter. "Don't you dare blame me," Thomas hissed. "Everyone knows it's the woman's failing when a marriage bears no fruit. They whisper about you, you know. Call you lazy. Say you're not trying hard enough." Faith touched her stinging face, tears blurring her vision. "And you believe them?" "What else am I to believe?" Thomas reached for the whiskey bottle. "My own father had 6 children. His father before him had 8. "Perhaps you should have married someone else then," Faith said quietly. Thomas drank directly from the bottle. "Perhaps I should have." The night passed in tense silence. Thomas eventually passed out in their bed, while Faith sat by the window, watching stars appear one by one. Once she had loved him. Once she had believed in the promise of their life together. Now she wondered if love could survive where hope had withered. Morning brought no resolution, just Thomas's thunderous headache and mumbled apology that contained no real remorse. Faith applied cold water to the bruise on her cheekbone and dressed for another day at the hotel. Thomas made no comment as she left, already reaching for the bottle to dull the edge of his hangover. Faith kept her head down as she walked, hoping no one would notice her injury. Promise Creek thrived on gossip, and she had no desire to add fuel to the stories that already circulated about her marriage. She entered the hotel through the back, as usual, but found Dorothy waiting with concerned eyes. "Lord have mercy, child. What happened to your face?" Faith touched her cheek self-consciously. "It's nothing. I walked into a door in the dark." Dorothy's expression made it clear she didn't believe the lie. "Faith Sullivan, I've known you since you were in pigtails. Don't insult me." Faith's composure threatened to crack. "Please, Dorothy. I can't talk about it." The older woman sighed heavily. "You know where to find me if you need help." She handed Faith a basket of linens. "Rooms 3 and 7 today. And that cowboy asked after you this morning." Faith's heart skipped unexpectedly. "Mr. Hayes? What did he say?" "Just asked if you'd be working today. Said he enjoyed your conversation." Dorothy gave her a knowing look. "He got the job at Whitman's, by the way. Starting tomorrow." Faith nodded, trying to appear casual. "That's good for him." As she worked, Faith found herself wondering if she might encounter Vaughn again. The thought brought a small flutter of anticipation that she immediately tried to suppress. Such feelings were inappropriate for a married woman, regardless of how unhappy that marriage might be. She was changing the bedding in room 3 when a knock sounded at the open door. Faith turned to find Vaughn standing there, hat in hand. "Good morning," he said, his eyes immediately fixing on her bruised cheek. His expression darkened. "Are you all right?" Faith turned away quickly. "Perfectly fine. Just clumsy is all." There was a heavy silence before Vaughn spoke again. "My mother used to be clumsy too, especially after my father had been drinking." Faith's hands trembled as she smoothed the fresh sheets. "Mr. Hayes." "Vaughn," he corrected gently. "Vaughn," she amended. "I appreciate your concern, but it's not necessary." He remained in the doorway studying her. "I got the job at Whitman's, starting tomorrow." Faith managed a smile. "Congratulations. Did you try Mabel's pie?" "I did. You were right about it being the best." He hesitated. "I was hoping you might join me there for lunch today." Faith stilled, finally meeting his gaze. "That wouldn't be appropriate. I'm married." Something flickered in Vaughn's eyes, disappointment. Perhaps, but also understanding. "As friends, then. I'm new in town and could use the company." Faith knew she should refuse. Nothing good could come from spending time with this man who stirred feelings she'd thought long buried. But the prospect of an hour away from judgment and disappointment was too tempting. "Just lunch," she agreed. "As friends." They walked to Mabel's cafe together, drawing curious glances from townspeople unused to seeing Faith in the company of anyone but Dorothy, or, rarely, Thomas. Faith felt self-conscious about her bruised cheek, but Vaughn acted as though he didn't notice, keeping the conversation light as they settled at a corner table. "So you've lived in Promise Creek all your life?" Vaughn asked after they'd ordered. Faith nodded. "My parents moved here before I was born. My father was the town doctor until he passed 5 years ago. My mother followed him a year later." "I'm sorry for your loss," Vaughn said sincerely. "Were you already married then?" "Just barely. Thomas and I wed 6 months before my father died." Faith traced patterns on the tablecloth. "What about you? Where do you call home?" "Nowhere, really. I was born in Texas, worked cattle drives to Kansas, tried mining in Colorado, broke horses in Wyoming." His smile was wry. "I go where the work is." "That sounds lonely," Faith observed. Vaughn shrugged. "Sometimes. But there's a freedom in it too. The open sky, new horizons." "I've never been more than 20 miles from Promise Creek," Faith admitted. "Sometimes I dream of seeing the ocean." "The Pacific is magnificent," Vaughn said. Miles of endless blue meeting the sky makes a person feel small in the best possible way. Their food arrived, momentarily halting the conversation. Faith found herself relaxing in Vaughn's company, forgetting for a while the burden she carried daily. He told stories of his travels that made her laugh, and asked questions about her life that suggested genuine interest rather than obligation. "Why the hotel work?" he asked as they finished their meal. "If you don't mind my asking." Faith hesitated. "Thomas's carpentry business has been slow. We need the money." Vaughn nodded, his eyes traveling briefly to her bruised cheek. "And your husband doesn't mind you working?" "He minds," Faith said quietly. "But necessity outweighs preference." Something in Vaughn's expression suggested he understood more than she was saying. "Faith." "I should get back," she interrupted, suddenly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Dorothy will wonder where I've gone." Vaughn paid for their meal despite Faith's protests, and they walked back to the hotel in companionable silence. At the door, Faith turned to him. "Thank you for lunch. It was nice to talk." Vaughn studied her face, his expression serious. "If you ever need anything at all, I'm at Whitman's ranch." Faith nodded, knowing she would never seek him out but touched by the offer nonetheless. "Good luck with your new position." The days that followed settled into a routine. Faith worked at the hotel, kept her house, and endured Thomas's increasingly frequent outbursts. He never struck her again, but his words cut deeper than any physical blow could. The town's whispers continued, each month of her barrenness adding to the chorus of judgment. 2 weeks after their lunch, Faith encountered Vaughn in town while buying supplies at the general store. He looked different somehow, more settled, perhaps, with his hair trimmed and new clothes that spoke of steady work. His smile when he saw her was warm, lighting something within her that had grown cold. "Faith," he greeted, tipping his hat. "How have you been?" "Well enough," she replied, conscious of curious eyes watching them. "And you? How's life at Whitman's?" "Good work with good people," Vaughn said. "Whitman's a fair man, just as you said." They chatted briefly about inconsequential matters before Faith excused herself, all too aware of Mrs. Abernathy's keen observation from nearby. As she left, Vaughn called after her. "Faith, Whitman's having a barn dance Saturday next. The whole town's invited." Faith hesitated. "I don't know if we'll attend. Thomas isn't one for dancing." Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Well, if you change your mind, there'll be good food and better company." The idea of the barn dance lingered in Faith's mind as she walked home. It had been so long since she'd done anything purely for enjoyment. Thomas would likely refuse, preferring the saloon to community gatherings where he'd have to face the pity of men whose wives had given them children. To her surprise, when she mentioned the dance that evening, Thomas showed interest. "Might be good to get out," he said, more sober than usual. "Show folks we're doing fine." Faith agreed cautiously, not wanting to question this rare moment of accord. Perhaps this was a chance for them to find their way back to each other, to remember why they had married in the first place. Saturday arrived clear and warm. Faith wore her best dress, a blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranged her hair with special care. Thomas appeared from their bedroom freshly shaven, wearing his good shirt. "You look pretty," he said, the compliment so unexpected that Faith blushed. "Thank you. You look handsome yourself." They walked to Whitman's ranch together, Thomas's hand occasionally brushing hers in a gesture that reminded Faith of their courtship days. She allowed hope to flutter cautiously in her chest. The barn was transformed with lanterns and wildflowers, a small band playing lively tunes as couples whirled across the floor. Whitman himself greeted them at the entrance, his wife smiling warmly at Faith. "Glad you could make it," Oliver Whitman said, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. "Help yourselves to food and drink. Faith scanned the crowd, her eyes finding Vaughn before she could stop herself. He stood across the barn, deep in conversation with one of the ranch hands, but looked up as though sensing her gaze. Their eyes met briefly before Faith looked away, heat rising to her cheeks. Thomas led her to the refreshment table where they accepted cups of punch. Several neighbors greeted them, and for once, no one mentioned children or Faith's failure to produce them. The atmosphere was festive, the community coming together in celebration rather than judgment. "Would you like to dance?" Thomas asked after they'd finished their punch. Faith nodded, pleasure warming her at this unexpected consideration. Thomas led her to the dance floor, placing his hand at her waist as they joined the other couples. It wasn't perfect. Thomas had never been a skilled dancer, but Faith found herself enjoying the moment nonetheless. As the evening progressed, Thomas excused himself to talk with some men about potential work. Faith found a seat along the wall, content to watch the dancers and enjoy the music. She was so absorbed in the scene that she didn't notice Vaughn approach until he spoke. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Sullivan?" Faith looked up, startled. "I don't think, just as friends," he assured her, extending his hand. "Your husband seems occupied, and it's a shame for you to miss the music." Faith hesitated, glancing toward Thomas, who was engaged in animated conversation near the punch bowl. One dance couldn't hurt, surely. "All right," she agreed, placing her hand in his. Vaughn led her onto the floor just as the band started a waltz. His hand at her waist was respectful but firm, his other hand holding hers with careful consideration. He moved with surprising grace for such a tall man, guiding her effortlessly through the steps. "You dance well," Faith observed, trying to ignore the warmth that spread from every point where they touched. "My mother insisted I learn," Vaughn replied with a smile. "Said no son of hers would stomp around a dance floor like a wounded buffalo?" Faith laughed, the sound surprising her. When was the last time she had laughed so freely? "You have a beautiful laugh," Vaughn said softly. "You should use it more often." Faith's smile faded slightly. "There hasn't been much cause for laughter lately." Vaughn's eyes held hers as they turned. "Everyone deserves joy, Faith." The simple statement touched something deep within her. For so long, she had accepted her unhappiness as a just punishment for her failure as a wife. The idea that she might deserve happiness regardless seemed almost heretical. "Even barren women?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Vaughn's step faltered momentarily. "Is that what they call you?" Faith looked away. "Among other things. Lazy, lacking, deficient." "They're wrong," Vaughn said, his voice low and intense. "A woman's worth isn't measured by the children she bears." Faith's eyes stung with unexpected tears. "In Promise Creek it is." "Then Promise Creek is wrong too." Vaughn's hand tightened slightly around hers. "You're already enough, Faith. Just as you are." The words pierced Faith's carefully constructed defenses. How long had she waited to hear something like that? How desperately had she needed anyone to see her value beyond her empty womb? Before she could respond, a rough hand grabbed her arm, yanking her away from Vaughn. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Thomas's face was flushed with anger and alcohol. Apparently, the punch bowl hadn't contained only punch. "We were just dancing, Thomas," Faith said, aware of the curious stares turning their way. "Dancing?" Thomas sneered. "Looked like more than dancing to me." Vaughn stepped forward, his posture tense but controlled. "Your wife did nothing inappropriate, Mr. Sullivan. I asked her to dance because she was sitting alone." "Stay out of this, Cowboy," Thomas warned. "This is between me and my wife." "Thomas, please," Faith implored, mortified by the scene they were creating. "Let's go home." "Home?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "To what? An empty house with empty rooms that should be filled with children? Children you've denied me?" The cruel words, spoken loudly enough for nearby dancers to hear, caused a ripple of whispers. Faith felt the familiar shame wash over her. "That's enough," Vaughn said firmly. "You're embarrassing your wife and yourself." Thomas released Faith's arm to face Vaughn squarely. "Mind your business, Hayes. Everyone in town knows she's failed as a wife. Can't even do the one thing a woman's made for." The slap of Dorothy's hand against Thomas's cheek cracked through the momentary silence. The older woman had appeared beside them, her normally kind face fierce with anger. "Thomas Sullivan, you should be ashamed," Dorothy hissed. "Blaming your wife when it takes two to make a child. Have you ever considered the fault might lie with you?" Thomas's face reddened further. "How dare you?" "No, how dare you?" Dorothy interrupted. "Faith has endured your cruelty, and this town's gossip with more dignity than you deserve. And now you humiliate her publicly?" Oliver Whitman stepped forward, his commanding presence immediately drawing attention. "I think it's time you left, Sullivan. This is a celebration, not a place for airing private matters." Thomas looked from Whitman to Vaughn, then to Faith, his expression hardening. "Fine, but she comes with me." Faith hesitated, torn between public scandal and private misery. Before she could decide, Vaughn spoke quietly. "Faith doesn't have to go anywhere she doesn't want to." Thomas's fists clenched. "She's my wife." "And her own person," Vaughn countered. The tension crackled between the two men. Faith knew she needed to defuse the situation before it escalated further. "I'll go home, Thomas," she said resignedly. "Let's not make more of a scene." "Faith," Vaughn began, but she silenced him with a look. "It's all right. Thank you for the dance." She turned to Dorothy. "And thank you for your kindness." Dorothy squeezed her hand. "You know where to find me if you need me, child." Faith followed Thomas from the barn, conscious of the stares and whispers that followed them. The walk home was conducted in frigid silence, the night air chilling the sweat on Faith's skin. When they reached their house, Thomas immediately reached for the whiskey bottle. "Was that your plan all along?" he demanded after a long swallow. "To humiliate me in front of the whole town?" "I did nothing to humiliate you," Faith replied tiredly. "You managed that yourself." "I saw the way you looked at him," Thomas accused, "like some lovesick girl instead of a married woman." Faith turned away, unwilling to examine the truth of his words too closely. "I'm going to bed." "What's he been telling you?" Thomas persisted, following her to the bedroom. "That he doesn't care if you can't have children? That he thinks you're perfect just as you are?" Faith flinched at how closely Thomas had guessed Vaughn's words. "He has," Thomas realized, reading her reaction. "And you believed him?" He laughed harshly. "Men will say anything to get under a woman's skirts, Faith. Don't be a fool." "Stop it, Thomas," Faith said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "Just stop." "Did you think he'd rescue you?" Thomas continued relentlessly. "Take you away from your failure of a husband? Give you the life you think you deserve?" "I never. You're damaged goods, Faith. No man wants a barren wife. Even Hayes would tire of you once he realized you couldn't give him sons." The words cut deeply, reinforcing fears Faith had harbored for years. She turned away, unwilling to let Thomas see her tears. "Get out," she whispered. "What did you say?" Thomas demanded. "Get out," Faith repeated louder this time. "Sleep in the barn or the saloon or wherever you've been spending your nights, but not here, not tonight." Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "You're throwing me out of my own house? The house you built but hardly live in anymore?" Faith faced him fully now, finding strength in her despair. "Yes, I am." For a moment, Thomas looked as though he might strike her again. Then, abruptly, he turned and stormed from the room. Faith heard the front door slam moments later, followed by silence so profound it seemed to press against her eardrums. She sank onto the bed, finally allowing the tears to flow freely. Everything had unraveled so quickly. The fragile hope she'd nurtured for the evening lay in ruins, and with it, the last pretense that her marriage could be salvaged. But beneath the grief and humiliation, Faith felt something else stirring a tiny spark of defiance. Thomas's words had been cruel, designed to crush her spirit, but they had instead illuminated a truth she had been avoiding. She deserved better than this half-life of recrimination and blame. The thought of Vaughn's words returned to her. "You're already enough, Faith, just as you are." Could it be true? Could her value as a woman, as a human being, exist independently of her ability to bear children? Faith lay awake most of the night, her mind circling between doubt and determination. By morning, she had made a decision. She could not continue living this way, allowing herself to be diminished daily by Thomas's bitterness and the town's judgment. She packed a small bag with essential items, knowing she could not take much without raising suspicions. Dorothy had often offered her a place to stay, and Faith would take her up on it just until she could determine her next steps. As she prepared to leave, a knock sounded at the door. Faith froze, wondering if Thomas had returned, perhaps sobered and apologetic as he sometimes was after their worst arguments. But when she opened the door, it was Vaughn who stood on her porch, hat in hand and concern in his eyes. "I apologize for coming to your home," he said immediately, "but after last night, I needed to make sure you were all right." Faith glanced past him, checking to see if any neighbors were observing this improper visit. "You shouldn't be here." "I know." Vaughn shifted uncomfortably. But Dorothy was worried, and frankly, so was I. Faith hesitated, then stepped back. "Come in, quickly." Once inside, Vaughn noticed her packed bag. "You're leaving?" Faith nodded. "I can't stay, not after last night. I'm going to Dorothy's for a while." "Has he hurt you?" Vaughn asked directly. Faith's hand moved unconsciously to her cheek, where the bruise had faded but the memory remained fresh. "Not often." Vaughn's jaw tightened. "Once is too often." "I know that now." Faith sat heavily at the table. "For so long, I believed I deserved it somehow, that my failure to conceive was a punishment, and Thomas's cruelty just another form of that punishment." "Faith. But last night, when you said I was enough just as I am." She looked up at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "No one has ever said that to me before. Not even Thomas when we were courting." Vaughn moved to sit across from her, his expression serious. "I meant every word. A woman's value isn't tied to motherhood any more than a man's is tied to fatherhood." "But the Bible says—" "The Bible says a lot of things," Vaughn interrupted gently, "including that we should love one another, treat others with kindness, and not judge lest we be judged. Folks seem to forget those parts when it's convenient." Faith managed a small smile. "You sound like my father. He used to say people remember the parts of Scripture that support what they already believe." "Sounds like a wise man." Vaughn hesitated. "Faith, I know it's not my place, but I want to help you. Whatever you decide to do." Faith studied him, trying to understand his motivations. "Why? You barely know me." Vaughn considered his answer carefully. "When I first came to Promise Creek, I saw a woman with kind eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. I saw someone bearing a burden too heavy for one person, and I recognized something in you that reminded me of my mother before she found the courage to leave my father." "Your mother left your father?" "In Promise Creek, such an action was almost unheard of." Vaughn nodded. "I was 12. He'd been beating her for years, blaming her for everything from burnt dinner to bad weather. One day, she packed our things and we left. Started over in another town where no one knew us." "What happened to your father?" "Drank himself to death within a year," Vaughn said without emotion. "But my mother lived another 20 years in peace, never remarried, but she was happier alone than she ever was with him. Faith absorbed this story, finding both comfort and fear in it. Did people judge her? For leaving? Some did, Vaughn acknowledged. But she used to say, "I'd rather face the judgment of strangers than live with the certainty of misery." The words resonated deeply with Faith. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "I don't know how to start over." "One step at a time," Vaughn said simply, "and you don't have to do it alone." Before Faith could respond, the door burst open. Thomas stood there, disheveled and red-eyed, his gaze moving from Faith to Vaughn and back again. "I knew it," he spat. "The minute my back is turned, you invite him into our home." Faith rose quickly. "It's not what you think, Thomas. Isn't it?" Thomas's eyes fixed on her packed bag. "Planning to run away with your cowboy?" "Mr. Sullivan," Vaughn began, his voice calm but firm, "I came to check on your wife's welfare after your behavior last night. Nothing improper has occurred." Thomas laughed bitterly. "Of course you'd say that. Did she tell you she's barren? That she can't give you children any more than she could give them to me?" Faith flinched at the cruel words, but Vaughn's expression didn't change. "If that matters to you so much," Vaughn said quietly, "perhaps you're not worthy of children in the first place." Thomas lunged forward suddenly, his fist connecting with Vaughn's jaw. The cowboy staggered back but didn't fall, quickly regaining his balance and blocking a second blow. "Stop it, both of you!" Faith cried, moving between them. "This solves nothing." "Get out of the way, Faith," Thomas growled. "This is between men." "No," Faith said firmly, standing her ground. "This is about me, and I won't have you fighting over me like I'm some piece of property with no say in the matter." Her unexpected defiance momentarily silenced both men. "Thomas," Faith continued, turning to her husband, "our marriage has been over in all but name for a long time. We both know that. My leaving isn't about Vaughn or any other man. It's about me finally finding the courage to admit we can't go on this way." Thomas's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by a weariness that aged him visibly. "So that's it? 3 years of marriage and you're just walking away?" 3 years of blame and disappointment, Faith corrected gently. "We've both been unhappy, Thomas. You know that as well as I do." Thomas looked from Faith to Vaughn, then back again. "And him? Is he part of your plans?" Faith glanced at Vaughn, whose expression remained carefully neutral. "My only plan right now is to stay with Dorothy until I figure out what comes next. Whatever happens after that will be my choice, not something decided for me by you or anyone else." A tense silence followed her declaration. Finally, Thomas stepped back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Take what you need then," he said, his voice hollow. "I'll be at the saloon." After he left, Faith released a shaky breath. Vaughn touched her arm gently. "Are you all right?" Faith nodded, though in truth she felt unmoored, adrift between the familiar shore of her marriage and an unknown sea of possibilities. "I can't quite believe I did that." "You were brave," Vaughn said simply. "Let me help you to Dorothy's." They walked through town together, Faith acutely aware of the curious stares their passage attracted. By nightfall, all of Promise Creek would know she had left Thomas, and the whispers would take on new life. But somehow, the prospect didn't terrify her as it once would have. Dorothy welcomed Faith with open arms, asking no questions and offering no judgment. She prepared a small room at the back of her home, assuring Faith she could stay as long as needed. "You'll be wanting some time alone, I expect," Dorothy said, glancing meaningfully at Vaughn, who lingered in the doorway. Faith nodded gratefully. "Thank you, both of you." After Dorothy tactfully withdrew, Faith turned to Vaughn. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary," Vaughn assured her. "I'm just glad you're safe." Faith studied him, This man who had entered her life so unexpectedly and helped her find courage she didn't know she possessed. What happens now? That's entirely up to you, Vaughn said. But whatever you decide, I hope you'll allow me to be part of your life in some way. The admission hung between them, neither fully expressed nor completely hidden. Faith recognized the feelings growing between them, feelings that had no place while she was still legally bound to another man. I need time, she said honestly, to figure out who I am apart from Thomas, apart from everyone's expectations. Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. Time is something I can give. In the days that followed, Promise Creek buzzed with gossip about Faith's departure from her marital home. Some, like Mrs. Abernathy, clucked their tongues in disapproval, declaring that a proper wife would endure any hardship to honor her vows. Others, particularly those who had witnessed Thomas's behavior at the barn dance, were more sympathetic. Faith threw herself into work, taking on additional hours at the hotel and helping Dorothy with her seamstress business. The activity kept her mind occupied and her hands busy, preventing her from dwelling too long on uncertainty or regret. Thomas made no attempt to contact her, though Faith occasionally glimpsed him entering or leaving the saloon, looking increasingly unkempt. Part of her ached for the young man she had married, whose dreams had turned to bitterness when life failed to meet his expectations. Vaughn maintained a respectful distance, understanding her need for independence. He continued working at Whitman's ranch, but Faith would sometimes see him in town, exchanging brief, friendly greetings that carried undercurrents of deeper feeling. A month after Faith left Thomas, Oliver Whitman stopped by Dorothy's house one evening. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, removing his hat as Faith answered the door. "Might I have a word?" Faith invited him in, curious about this unexpected visit from one of Promise Creek's most respected citizens. "I'll be direct," Whitman said once they were seated. "I've been looking for someone to manage the household at the ranch. My wife's health isn't what it used to be, and we need help with cooking, cleaning, and general organization." Faith blinked in surprise. "And you're offering this position to me?" Whitman nodded. "You'd have your own cabin on the property, meals provided, and a fair wage. Dorothy speaks highly of your capabilities." The offer was unexpected but intriguing. Faith had been wondering how she would support herself long-term, knowing she couldn't impose on Dorothy's generosity indefinitely. "What about Mr. Hayes?" she asked cautiously. "Would working at the ranch create complications?" Whitman's expression suggested he understood her concern. "Hayes is employed in the fields and with the horses. Your paths would cross, certainly, but if both parties maintain professionalism, I see no issue." Faith considered the proposal. A position at Whitman's would provide independence and distance from the daily scrutiny of Promise Creek. It might also give her space to consider her future more clearly. "I would be grateful for the opportunity," she said finally. Whitman smiled, pleased. "Excellent. You can move in at the end of the week if that suits you." After he left, Faith shared the news with Dorothy, who seemed unsurprised. "I may have mentioned to Mrs. Whitman that you were looking for a more permanent situation," Dorothy admitted. "The fresh air will do you good, child." Faith suspected there was more to the arrangement than Dorothy acknowledged, perhaps an attempt to position her near Vaughn, but she appreciated the opportunity regardless of its origins. On Friday, Faith packed her few belongings and bid Dorothy a grateful farewell, promising to visit whenever she came to town. Oliver Whitman himself came to transport her to the ranch, a sprawling property 3 miles outside Promise Creek. The cabin that would be Faith's new home was small but tidy, with a comfortable bed, wooden table and chairs, and a stone fireplace. It stood a short distance from the main house, offering privacy while maintaining convenient access to her workplace. Mrs. Whitman, a gentlewoman whose health had indeed been fragile, welcomed Faith warmly and showed her the responsibilities of the position. Faith would oversee meals for the Whitmans and the 6 ranch hands who lived on the property, maintain the cleanliness of the main house, and assist with any other household tasks that arose. As Faith settled into her new routine, she found unexpected peace in the rhythmic nature of ranch life. Each day brought its own challenges and satisfactions, from baking fresh bread before dawn to ensuring the ranch hands had hearty meals to sustain them through long days of physical labor. She saw Vaughn daily, though their interactions remained appropriately distant. He would tip his hat when they passed in the yard, inquire politely about her adjustment to ranch life during meals, but never press for more than she was ready to give. 2 months into her new position, Faith received word from Dorothy that Thomas had left Promise Creek. Apparently, he had sold their small house and departed for California, telling those who asked that there was nothing left for him in Montana Territory. The news affected Faith more deeply than she had anticipated. Despite everything, Thomas had been her husband, her first love, the man with whom she had planned to build a life. His departure represented the final dissolution of those dreams, leaving Faith truly on her own for the first time. That evening, as Faith sat outside her cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, she heard footsteps approaching. Vaughn stood a respectful distance away, hat in hand. "Dorothy sent word about Thomas," he said. "I thought you might want company, but only if it's welcome." Faith gestured to the bench beside her. "It is." Vaughn sat, leaving space between them. For a while they simply watched the sun's descent in companionable silence. "Are you all right?" Vaughn asked finally. Faith considered the question honestly. "I think so. It's strange I feel both sadness and relief, as though I've put down a heavy burden but still feel the ghost of its weight." Vaughn nodded understanding. "Endings are complicated that way." "Even when they're necessary," Faith agreed. She turned to look at him directly. "I've had a lot of time to think these past months about what I want, who I want to be." "And what have you decided?" Vaughn's voice was gentle, without pressure. "That I'm tired of being defined by what I lack," Faith said firmly, "by the children I haven't had or the wife I couldn't be. I want to be valued for who I am, not measured against what others think I should be." "You deserve that," Vaughn said simply. Faith studied him, this man who had shown her more respect in a few months than Thomas had in years. "Why did you help me that day?" "The truth." Vaughn considered his answer carefully. "When I first saw you at the hotel, there was something in your eyes, a kind of quiet dignity, despite obvious pain. It reminded me of my mother, yes, but it was more than that." He paused, choosing his words with care. "I recognized a spirit that deserved better than what it was receiving. And then, as I came to know you, I discovered a woman of remarkable strength, kindness, and intelligence." "And my barrenness?" Faith asked directly. "Does it not concern you?" "Why would it?" Vaughn's response was immediate and sincere. "A woman is not a breeding mare, Faith. Her value isn't determined by her ability to produce offspring." Faith's eyes filled with tears at the simple acceptance in his words. "Most men want sons." "Most men want too many things they haven't earned," Vaughn replied. "I want a partner. Someone to share joys and sorrows, to build a life that matters. Children would be a blessing, but their absence wouldn't diminish the worth of the partnership." Faith absorbed his words, feeling something unfurl within her chest, a cautious hope, long suppressed by years of judgment and disappointment. "I care for you, Faith," Vaughn continued quietly. "More than I expected to, more quickly than I thought possible. But I understand if you need more time, or if your feelings don't match mine." Faith's heart beat rapidly as she contemplated her response. The proper thing would be to wait, to observe a period of mourning for her failed marriage before entertaining thoughts of another. But Promise Creek and its proprieties seemed far away now, less important than the truth of her own heart. "I care for you too," she admitted, "but I'm afraid." Of what? Of trusting again. Of believing in possibilities that might not materialize. Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. Then we take it slowly, one day at a time. Over the following weeks, Faith and Vaughn's relationship developed gradually. They began taking evening walks after dinner, talking about their pasts, their hopes, their views on everything from politics to poetry. Vaughn spoke of his travels, describing the ocean Faith longed to see with such vivid detail that she could almost taste the salt spray. Faith shared stories of her parents, the lessons her father had taught her about healing and compassion, her mother's quiet strength in the face of frontier hardships. As autumn turned the aspen trees to gold, Vaughn asked Faith if she would accompany him on a Sunday ride. They packed a simple picnic and rode into the foothills, where Vaughn led her to a secluded meadow overlooking a series of cascading waterfalls. "It's beautiful," Faith breathed, dismounting to better appreciate the view. "I found it my first week here," Vaughn said, spreading a blanket on the grass. "Reminded me that beauty can be hidden just beyond what we think we know." They shared bread, cheese, and apples, talking easily about small matters. As they finished eating, Vaughn grew more serious. "I received a letter yesterday," he said, "from a friend in Oregon Territory. He's offering me partnership in a horse breeding operation near the coast." Faith felt her heart constrict. "You're leaving." "I'm considering it," Vaughn corrected gently. "It's a good opportunity. Land of my own. Work I enjoy. Near the ocean I've told you about." "I see." Faith tried to keep disappointment from her voice. She had no claim on him, no right to expect him to stay for her sake. "The thing is," Vaughn continued, reaching for her hand, "I can't imagine going without you." Faith's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm asking if you'd consider coming with me," Vaughn said simply. "Not as my housekeeper or cook, but as my wife." The proposal, so direct and unexpected, left Faith momentarily speechless. "I know it seems sudden," Vaughn continued into the silence, "and if you need more time, I understand. But I love you, Faith. I believe we could build something good together, something honest." Faith looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of doubt or deception. She found only sincerity and a depth of feeling that matched her own. "What if I still can't have children?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. "Then we'll be a family of two," Vaughn answered without hesitation. "Or we might take in children who need homes. There are many ways to create a family, Faith." Faith thought of Promise Creek, of the whispers that had followed her, the judgment that had worn her down day by day. She thought of Thomas, whose love had been conditional on her ability to produce heirs, and she thought of Vaughn, who had seen her value when she herself had forgotten it. "Yes," she said finally, her voice gaining strength with the decision. "Yes, I will go with you. I will be your wife." Vaughn's smile was radiant as he gathered her into his arms. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise of tenderness to come, but it deepened quickly as years of loneliness gave way to the certainty of being truly seen and accepted. When they returned to the ranch, flushed and happy, Mrs. Whitman took one look at them and smiled knowingly. "I take it congratulations are in order?" Faith nodded, slightly embarrassed by how obvious their feelings must be. "Vaughn has asked me to marry him before he takes a position in Oregon. And you've accepted," Mrs. Whitman finished for her. "I'm glad. You both deserve happiness." Oliver Whitman was equally supportive, though regretful about losing two valued employees. "We'll miss you both, but new beginnings are to be celebrated, not mourned." The following Sunday, Faith and Vaughn were married in a simple ceremony in the Whitmans' parlor. Dorothy traveled from town to stand with Faith, her eyes brimming with happy tears. The ranch hands served as witnesses, their rough cheers a testament to the respect Vaughn had earned during his months of work. Faith wore a new dress of pale blue, sewn by Dorothy's skilled hands. Vaughn had traded his working clothes for a clean suit, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. When they spoke their vows, Faith felt none of the nervous uncertainty that had plagued her first wedding. Instead, a profound peace settled over her, a certainty that this man would stand beside her through whatever life might bring. They departed for Oregon a week later, traveling by stagecoach and then train. The journey was long and often uncomfortable, but Faith found joy in each new landscape, each unfamiliar town they passed through. Vaughn delighted in her wonder, pointing out sights she might miss and sharing stories of his previous travels through these regions. When they finally reached the Oregon coast, Faith stood speechless before the vastness of the Pacific. The endless expanse of water, meeting the sky in a distant blur of blue, was more magnificent than she had imagined. "What do you think?" Vaughn asked, his arm around her waist as they stood on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. "It's like standing at the edge of the world," Faith breathed. "It makes everything else seem so small." "Including the opinions of Promise Creek?" Vaughn suggested gently. Faith smiled, leaning into his embrace. "Especially those." Their new home was a sturdy cabin on a property that stretched from rolling meadows perfect for horses to a small copse of pine trees that sheltered them from coastal winds. Vaughn's business partner, Samuel, had built a successful foundation for their horse breeding operation, with several fine mares and 2 exceptional stallions already established. Faith settled into her role as rancher's wife with unexpected ease. She kept their home, prepared meals, and gradually took over the accounts for the business, discovering a talent for numbers that had gone unrecognized in Promise Creek. The local community welcomed them warmly, accepting Faith without questions about her childless state or past marriage. 6 months after their arrival, Faith received a letter from Dorothy with news from Promise Creek. Thomas had reportedly found work in San Francisco and remarried a widow with 2 young children from her previous marriage. "Are you all right?" Vaughn asked, finding Faith on the porch after reading the letter. "Strangely, yes," Faith replied truthfully. "I'm glad he's found what he wanted." "And you?" Vaughn sat beside her, taking her hand. "Have you found what you wanted?" Faith looked out over their land, where spring had brought wildflowers in riotous color. Beyond, the ocean glimmered in the afternoon sun, vast and ever-changing. And beside her sat a man who loved her for exactly who she was, who had never once made her feel lacking or incomplete. "I've found more than I dared to want," she said softly. "I've found home." A year into their marriage, Faith noticed changes in her body: tenderness, fatigue, nausea in the mornings. Having long ago resigned herself to childlessness, she initially attributed the symptoms to a passing illness. But as they persisted, a cautious hope began to form. The local midwife confirmed what Faith barely allowed herself to believe. She was expecting a child. When Faith told Vaughn, his joy was unreserved, but tempered with concern for her well-being. "Are you happy about this?" he asked, holding her close. "Truly." Faith considered the question honestly. For so long, motherhood had been a measure of her worth that she could never meet, a standard against which she was found wanting. Now, unexpectedly offered this gift, she found her feelings complex. "I'm happy," she said finally. "Not because it makes me more valuable or more of a woman. You've helped me understand that I was always enough, but because it's something we've created together, a new expression of what we share." Vaughn pressed his lips to her forehead. "That's exactly right. This child doesn't define you. It's just one more blessing in a life already rich with them." As Faith's body changed with the growing life within her, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this place. The pain and judgment she had endured in Promise Creek seemed distant now, like a story that had happened to someone else. She understood that her worth had never depended on her ability to conceive, but on the capacity for love and resilience that had always been within her. In the autumn of 1878, Faith gave birth to a daughter they named Hope. The irony of bearing a child after leaving a marriage that had defined her by that inability was not lost on Faith. Sometimes, she thought, life's greatest gifts arrive only when we stop measuring our worth by their presence. As she nursed her daughter beside the window overlooking the Pacific, Vaughn came to stand behind them, his hand resting gently on Faith's shoulder. "Happy?" he asked simply. Faith looked up at him, then down at their daughter, then out to the endless horizon where sea met sky. "Complete," she corrected. "But I would have been even without her." Vaughn nodded, understanding the important distinction. "You were already enough." "We both were," Faith agreed, reaching up to clasp his hand. "Everything else is just grace." Outside their window, the ocean continued its eternal dance with the shore, a reminder that life, like the tide, brings both what we expect and what we never dared to imagine. Faith had lost a home to find a truer one, had endured judgment to discover acceptance, had surrendered old dreams to make room for better ones. In the end, it wasn't a child that had healed her, but love that saw her value without conditions, that recognized her completeness when others saw only lack. Hope was a gift, but not the one that had saved her. That had happened long before, when a cowboy had looked at a woman deemed failing and insufficient, and declared with quiet certainty, "You're already enough."